1, 2, 3.
No, it'll be fine. Yeah.
Good evening. I want to welcome you to this forum for ballot propositions, and this is an event for the first time actually sponsored by PAC, Pocket Area Churches Together. It's something that we at Faith have been doing for a number of years. About every 4 years, right, Chuck? Maybe every 2 years sometimes. So we're grateful that you're here. Always funny to me on a Sunday morning, everyone spreads out. In the evenings, you huddle together as if there's some danger afoot. But I'm glad you're here, huddled together for this time. It's important, and I know here at Faith and St. Anthony and other places, we recognize as Christians that it's our responsibility to be involved in this way, in the politics of our land, and however God calls us to do that. And one way is to vote, and we want to vote intelligently. So we're grateful. I'm going to get out of the way, but this is Chuck Bell. This is Ned DeLessie. Chuck is a part of Faith. Ned's a part of St. Anthony Parish, and we're grateful to both of you to come and help us to wade through and understand the issues here. So I'm going to get out of the way and let you explain the process. We're going to take about 70 minutes or so maybe tonight. I did turn the air on, so it should get cooler. Take it away. Let's appreciate them for being here, by the way.
Well, when Jeff reached out to me and asked me if I would do this, he mentioned that Ned was going to be part of it, and because we're friends, we have been for a long time, and have been involved in pro-life activities primarily together. I thought it would be terrific to do this, so we're going to enjoy this, and I think the opportunity to for both of us to speak and comment may be of value added to this. So anyway, I'm very much looking forward to this, and Ned's going to say a few things, and then we'll kick it off.
See if it works first. Working first. There we go. Got it going. Thanks. Yes, it is a privilege to be here with Chuck, and now that he lives down in some other beautiful part of the world. Part of his time we don't get to see each other quite as often as we'd like to, so this was a real treat to be able to do this together. As Chuck mentioned, as Pastor Jeff mentioned, I'm a parishioner at St. Anthony's Parish. Chuck and I are both retired, so we have time to read that actual book that's out here. And I was the director of the California Catholic Conference, and so we were involved in political work for 30 years here in California. So it's not totally outside of my perspective here. I would also say that as I begin this, if you brought your ballot, we'll tell you all how to vote. No, just kidding, just kidding. Just kidding. But when I make some comments, I'm going to make them from the perspective of what we call in the Catholic experience faithful citizenship or Catholic social teaching. And in faithful citizenship, we're invited as Catholics to recognize that we have a responsibility as disciples to evangelize the world in which we live, and we have a responsibility as citizens to participate actively and to be part of that, and it's one of the ways in which we do it. The other piece of it that I would comment on is what's called Catholic social teaching, and in Catholic social teaching, we invite people to form their conscience, which means understand to the best of your ability the facts of what you're looking at. Understand that. And then consult your own tradition. Consult Scripture, consult your tradition, and hear what comments might be available on that particular topic. And then third, discuss it with people in a civil and responsible way so you get different perspectives on it. And then pray. And then act. Do something. Vote and do it. And so that's the process that we invite our Catholic brothers and sisters to do when we're engaged in this issue. Chuck knows much more about these initiatives than I do, so I'll just comment along the way.
Sure. Well, what we thought we'd do is to start with them and try and group them in issue order, if you will. So we're not going to go straight down from 2 to 36, but we plan to cover all of those. I thought maybe initially I'd mention that You know, the initiative process is very, very complicated, and it's an interplay between the people and the legislature. And the legislature also has a role in this, so we'll be talking about 5 measures that the legislature put on the ballot itself. Two of them happen to be bond issues, 2 or 3 are constitutional amendments, and that's within the legislature's authority to do. The people, on the other hand, are subject to qualification requirements by petition. So all of the matters that we'll be talking about that are citizen-sponsored initiatives, and they're actually identified by that in the official voter information guide, which I would highly recommend to you. You've probably all gotten it in the mail, and it's kind of daunting when you look at it. It's you know, 160 pages long. Most of that, I'll say, is the text of the measures that are being presented. So not only do you get the opportunity to see an official title and summary of each of the measures, which is prepared by the Attorney General and the legislative analyst, but you also have arguments, pro and con, that are submitted by the proponents and opponents of a measure. And then you get a legislative analysis, which is kind of a factual presentation by the legislative analyst with a little bit of background on what the measure is about and its effect on state law. So that's the process by which this happens. What's interesting to know is that there are about 7 measures that qualified for the ballot but will not appear on the ballot. And that happens for 2 reasons. One, in the last 20 years, the legislature devised a process whereby measures that are qualified for the ballot can be removed from the ballot before the deadline for qualifying for going on a particular ballot, in this case November 24, if there's a legislative compromise that's reached between the legislature and the proponents. So the other way that a measure can be taken off the ballot is if a court removes it. This year we had the California Supreme Court remove what would have been Proposition 1, which was a tax measure amending the Constitution in terms of the way in which taxes could be approved, mostly by 2/3 vote, of all types of taxes, including ones that are imposed by administrative agencies at the state and local level. So that was taken off the ballot, but there were another 6 that concerned a variety of subjects. I don't want to go through them because it's really not pertinent to your consideration of what you're going to be voting on, but understand that the process is kind of complicated, and so there's probably some legislative action that occurred with respect to some of them. In other instances, those ones that were taken off because the proponents employed them as a strategy. There were 2 referenda of previously adopted legislative measures, and there were legislative compromises of one sort or another that satisfied those proponents that they didn't need to spend the money or take the risk of losing a measure at the ballot. And it is an expensive proposition. I did a rough count, and I think we're at about $260 million that has been spent on one side or another of the propositions that are on your ballot. So that's actually lower than it's been in some recent years, when it may have gone as high as $500 million spent on one side or another of measures on a particular ballot.
I would just add to what Chuck's saying in the way of context and background. The first 5 we're going to deal with are put on by the legislature. So they put these on to put them before the people for your vote. And it's important to note when you're looking at this that, you know, on here, it will show on those 5 the vote in the legislature. And so that's important for people to recognize that, you know, who voted for this and who didn't vote for this. There are, you know, 80 people in the assembly, 80 members in the assembly, and of that, 62 are Democrats. So when you look at a measure and it says 62 to nothing, that means the Democrats put this on the ballot. Okay, and you know, and there are 40 in the Senate, and so when it says 31 to nothing, that means 9 Republicans didn't vote. Okay, because there are 31 Democrats. So, and you'll see mixed on those. Some of them, the Democrats and Republicans voted for them along the way, but it's just a piece of information for you to look at on these first 5 ballot measures. Chuck?
The other thing I would say, and just commend to you, there's a quick reference guide at the start of this official ballot pamphlet, and it has a quick reference, the summary of the title and summary of the measure as you would see it on your actual ballot, and a very short fiscal analysis, fiscal impact statement by the legislative analyst. And then, and this is a fairly new addition to the ballot itself, the ballot label has a list of 3 or more supporters or opponents of the measure. Now, one thing to know about that, as well as the ballot arguments that have authors whose affiliations are listed in the arguments, is that those are carefully selected. It may not be consistent with who has funded the measures, but often it lists groups that the proponents or opponents think would be cues to you in guiding how you might consider voting on a particular measure. So, you know, if the League of Women Voters is on one and the California Taxpayers Association's on the other, and the Chamber of Commerce and firefighters and so on, that's a voting cue for you. I'm not saying that you should follow that. You can follow it with the understanding that it was designed to create a positive attitude on your part toward either voting yes or no on a measure. So take it into account. There's also public reports of how much has been spent on behalf of a measure for each of these measures and who the major funding is from. So if you want to get further into the weeds on this and look at that and want to know who is spending the money on it, that is readily available. It's not in this book. Well, let's go ahead and start.
Let's jump on.
Okay,
3 and 5. We're going to jump on 3 and 5
We thought we'd start with what we call the value issues measure. The first one is a constitutional amendment that establishes, it repeals a prior constitutional provision and establishes a right to marry. Now, the right to marriage at least has been before the higher courts, and they've decided that same-sex marriage is permissible under the federal Constitution, and that is pretty much well established constitutionally at this point. So the measure and the discussion of it acknowledges that this is not a necessary amendment, and in fact it goes beyond it to establish a right of people to marry without limitation. I would say it's very broad. Ned, would you like to talk a little about that?
There was no opposition to this particular measure. At least no one voted against it in the legislature. You can see the vote there. Obviously, in the context of what we're dealing with in the Supreme Court decision that Chuck referenced, marriage between a man and a woman is no longer the only acceptable form of marriage in California. And this removes, and the entire initiative removes only this section, only marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized in California. And so, you know, if you're supportive of that particular situation or whatever, that's what it will do. The other opposition argument to it would be that it doesn't limit it to just two people. And it doesn't limit it to just consenting adults. All it says is what Chuck said, marriage is a fundamental right. And so it opens it up for potentially a lot of different folks to pursue what they would consider marriage in California legally and through the courts. So, you know, it sort of makes the status quo, it amends the Constitution of California to be consistent with the Supreme Court decision that marriage is not just between a man and a woman, but it does not clarify who can get married in California. So that's...
Yeah, and I think these open-ended provisions are always subject to litigation, and predictably, I think in this state, it's likely there will be some litigation over that issue if the measure passes to try to define the limits. It's possible that the legislature could do that, but really it belongs in the court because you've got a constitutional amendment, a provision of the state constitution that ultimately the courts, under their judicial review powers, can decide.
So it does, you know, solidify the current status quo, and it amends the Constitution of the state of California, which is always a challenging reality legally. So, number 3. That's number 3. This is ballot measure number 3, put on by the legislature.
So that means no.
What? No, it's up to you. I mean, if you feel like it's appropriate that we should, you know, that we should recognize this. If you want the status quo, when the current status quo is that marriage is between, you know, two people who want to get married, and, you know, whether you're gay or straight or whatever, you can get married in California. You know, the people of California voted one way on that, and the Supreme Court overturned it. And the Supreme Court said that it is not legal in any state to have marriage only between a man and a woman, that we have to recognize marriage between same-sex couples.
California, that they can have men to men get married and women to...
Yes.
So in that case, we don't want to go any further, then we should say no.
If that's your choice to make, whatever you would like to make. I'm just saying that, you know, there's the choice here is, do you affirm what the Supreme Court says in that particular reality, but recognize we're also changing the Constitution, and we're not changing it to limit marriage to anybody. We're just saying it can't be just between a man and a woman. Yes. Yes means that you take out that language that says this is between a man and a woman in California. That's all it does. You take that out, and that's what it says. And you take that out of there, and the reality that is current goes on and on and on. What Chuck and I are saying is that because you're amending the Constitution, and the Constitution has it as a fundamental right, other people who have other visions of marriage, you know, may decide to change that. But that's, whether you view that as a problem or not is up to your conscience and how you view that down the road.
Let me just say
No, I said the only thing that's changed in this right now is the Constitution, which currently says in California marriage is only between a man and a woman. And that is not consistent with the Supreme Court ruling. And so that means that, you know, the current status quo, it would become the law. The thing that you have to think about is they're amending the Constitution, which gives a fundamental right to marriage, and there is no definition of marriage. And so if you're comfortable with there's no definition of marriage, fine. If you're not, you know, you might want to, if you're not, you vote no, and if you're comfortable with, you know, with the way it is currently, you can vote yes.
I think that we've just highlighted a challenge that you always have in these things, which is the actual language is what governs, not what people say in the ballot arguments, but you have to look at the language. Had they just deleted that provision that said a marriage between a man and a woman is legally the only thing in California, that would have left the status quo, would have just clarified it. So it's not a simple repeal, but by adding that additional language, they create the possibility that there could be litigation over, you know, more than two, and that sort of thing, by parties that want to do that. We're in a litigious society, a litigious legal environment, so that is a possibility. So, as the measure says, if that's a concern that you have in your own conscience, a no vote would still leave in place the federal constitutional right of a man and a man to, and a woman to marry.
But it says, when you said yes, here it says that the California Constitution would be updated to men who currently can marry. So which means they can update to whatever they want.
Let me make a suggestion that we hold questions.
Yeah, we'll do some questions in just a minute here. Let's cover one more and then we'll do it.
Partly because folks online can't hear the question, so let's hold questions.
Yeah, and I'll
then
repeat the
I'll
question.
come around at the right time, and you can ask questions, and the folks online can hear as well. So
Yeah, we'll clarify that in a minute. Let's do 5 right now too, Chuck.
Okay. So
We'll
let's hold it for one more, and then
we'll come back to that, Rick. We'll come back to the question.
So number 6, Proposition 6, eliminates a constitutional provision that allows involuntary servitude for people who are in prison or incarcerated in jail. It's really a measure that has a similar problem that as the one we just discussed, which is that involuntary servitude or slavery has been outlawed by the federal Constitution, and that was the Civil War that led to that, and the state Constitution picked that up. But the involuntary servitude in this case is specifically defined to mean imposing conditions upon people who are incarcerated that would require them to work without compensation in the prison system. So this measure, like the other one, went beyond there was no need to repeal anything with respect to anti-slavery provisions, but the interpretation of involuntary servitude, that's a specific language in the federal Constitution too, is that there are many other kinds of compulsory work situations, and the ones in the prisons are the most common. Again, this was put on the ballot by the legislature, and
there was no real argument made against it. Basically, it says that you can't force people in prison to work. And currently, people in prison they work in a variety of ways, some of it mandatory, some of it chosen. Some work doing firefighting, some work training dogs, some work doing a variety of other things along the way. Some, depending on your sentence, you can get good time credit and that type of thing. So there's still incentives for prisoners to work if they choose to do so. This just says the state cannot force them to work. If you just want to sit there in prison, we can't force you to work. There was no opposition to the ballot measure in the legislature at all when they debated it.
Yeah. There is various types of compensation in prison for labor. Some of it is used and is put into the victim restitution fund that's maintained by the state. As Ned said, there are some opportunities for prisoners to work, get an education, maybe get good time credit that's issued that would reduce their sentence.
And that will not be eliminated if you vote yes on this. It just, all you're saying is that you can't force them to work.
I think we're done with the...
So that's number 3 and number 6, okay? The sort of
one gentleman
value-based.
back
Rick,
here
you got
had
a question back there, Rick? Rick? Yeah, that's fine. The legislature has put it before us as a people to say, will we amend the Constitution to eliminate that marriage in California is only between a man and a woman, which will be consistent with the Supreme Court ruling. That's what they're asking us to vote yes on. All we're saying is that you can vote yes on it if your conscience says that's what you want to do. Just understand the context is that in our rather litigious society, when you leave in fundamental right to marriage, you open the door for people who have other descriptions of marriage to challenge that. And you know, it doesn't make anybody, it doesn't legalize anything else right now than what is currently legal. It just opens the door for challenge along the way. The people will vote on this. This is put on the ballot by the legislature. The people will vote on it. And so I think that gets back to your question. We're not, I think I made it real clear. Yes? No. I said, what I said was, if you vote yes, the only thing you're voting on is to remove marriages between one man and one woman in California. That's the current constitutional language, which has been judged illegal by the Supreme Court of the United States, which says you cannot limit it to just a man and a woman. You have to be able to marry a man, and you have to have a woman be able to marry a woman. All we're saying is that, you know, and so all you're doing is removing that language of man and woman from the Constitution. And you know, if you're comfortable with that, and that's what you want to have happen, and you're comfortable living with that definition of marriage, there's no big deal. The concern, not the opposition, the concern is that we have it also says marriage is a fundamental right in California. And if you do not have a definition of what marriage is, and it's a fundamental right, it opens it to the prospects of people deciding, they can decide what they think marriage is, and they will eventually sue, you know, and say, we want to do this. And so if you're concerned about that, vote no. If you're not concerned about that, vote yes. Can't understand what you're saying. Yeah, and you know, and we don't want to get into all the arguments or whatever. We're just saying that, you know, be clear what the initiative says. You're voting to remove a man and a woman, and that's the current reality supported by the Supreme Court, and that's what it is. And if you have another concern, you can do that. You know, you can move from that direction. But let's move on to the other initiatives here.
We're going to talk about two bond measures.
The two bond measures.
Yes, Proposition 2, which is a school bond measure, and Proposition 4, which was an environmental measure. And just by way of background, the state has had in the Constitution the opportunity for the people to vote on any bond measure that's a state general obligation bond. Typically, general obligation bonds are used to fund long-term projects or infrastructure improvement that is not part of the state annual budget. And it's to be able to fund those things that may be larger projects than the state annual budget can accommodate. This is not only for the Proposition 2 is for local schools as well as community colleges, but not for higher education above community college. And it's a $10 billion bond, and if approved, a bond like that is repayable over time, typically from 30 to 40 years. And interest is paid on that bond, and that's paid by state funds. So this would be then the general fund of the state of California annually would be making interest payments to the bond holders to pay for that over a period of time. There is a nice section in this that explains the bond funding process. I think it's on page 65. And so I would look at that if you want further information on it. Generally speaking, at current interest rates, the cost of a $10 billion face bond is going to be about $16 billion over that period of time of repayment. And for the same is true, or roughly true, for Proposition 4, which is to fund a variety of different environmental, water quality, land acquisition for parks, and that sort of thing. And again, for the details on that, take a look at the ballot pamphlet and the sections that talk about the specifics. In particular, the legislative analyst has a very thorough report on all of that. The question with the bonds is always, should we do it now? And then is this the kind of thing that should be funded by bonds? And is it for worthy projects? So in considering how you might vote on that, you'd probably take into account one or more of those factors. I'm not sure there's much else that I can say about it.
Yeah, I think, again, you look at the need and the solution to the need. There's a need put forward there in terms of education, and then there's a solution put forward in terms of a bond. That bond, will be paid for by us as taxpayers over the course of time. So just appreciate that and understand that as you're moving forward on it. And then, see if it's something that you think you want to do. The Proposition 4 on the I would say the environmental infrastructure, I guess you'd say along the way there, is an interesting situation. The Democratic legislators put this on the ballot because they didn't think that we had enough money currently, to fund a lot of those things that needed to be funded along the way. And so they're asking us as the voters to fund those things. Take a look at it and see what you think. And without getting into an opinion one way or the other on it, but it is a bond measure, and a bond measure always is our responsibility. We're going to pay for it over the course of time.
The general obligation bonds are not paid by property taxes per se. They're paid by general fund revenues of the state, and that's a mix of individual and corporate income taxes, excise taxes, user fees. I think those are the principal different types of sources of income to that.
Definitely, and Proposition 4 is primarily, in my opinion, on the ballot because of the deficit that the legislature has in terms of our current budget deficit, and yet the need that they put forward to deal with these projects, infrastructure around the environment. And so they decided that the better way to do it was not to, since we're in a budget deficit, we couldn't come up with the money here, so we'll do a bond that will last over this course of time, and we'll pay for that incrementally out of the budget, which is funded by our taxes.
And that, I'll just note that at the present time, this would be subject to a 2/3 vote.
Correct.
Requirement. So it would require 2/3 or 66 7% yes vote in order for that bond to be adopted. Which brings me to Proposition 5. Proposition 5.
So we've done 3 and 6, 2 and 4, and now we're doing 5.
Proposition 5 is not a specific funding of a bond, but it is an amendment to Proposition 13, the property tax Howard Jarvis measure that was adopted in 1978, which would change the requirement for approval of such general obligation bonds at the state and local levels for certain types of projects from a 2/3 vote requirement to 55%. About 10 or 15 years ago, the state, voters of the state adopted that for school bond funding. So now, for example, all of the school bond funds that are appearing on your local ballot that may be put on by the school district or the community college district are subject to a 55% approval for passage. This would extend that to additional categories of spending, specifically infrastructure project spending, and also for affordable housing programs. So it's categorical. The opponents of the measure say, you know, it's a breach of Proposition 13. It's going to inevitably lead to a raise in property taxes at the local level. At the state level, again, as I mentioned, the funding for repayment of bond obligations is from different sources than property tax revenue, but at the local level, most certainly it's property taxes that are affected by that. The proponents say that the infrastructure projects are long-term and that they're for a variety of things that you would think of as typical long-term project-funded measures at the state and local levels for a variety of things like roads, bridges, airport facilities, things of that sort. The opponents of it say the definition of infrastructure is very broad and cuts a bigger hole in Proposition 13 than the proponents suggest. The affordable housing program funding would allow for both local governments and the state government to fund a variety of different housing programs for people who cannot afford it, and it's in that sense, you know, it's got some attractiveness as a political issue because of the general affordability problems for housing in the state.
And the legislature obviously put this on the ballot because, as Chuck has said, they would like us to change the 2/3 voting on these type of bond issues to a 55% and enhance the prospects that this would pass, you know, the initiatives we just talked about, you know, that in the future, if they wanted to do something like Proposition 2 and 4, that we would be voting on, we'd be doing a 55% vote. So the issue is whether or not you're first and foremost comfortable with moving the vote on this kind of a bond issue taxation from a vote from 60% to 50, or 2/3 to 55% or not. And then there's obviously the need that's out there that you can look at and see what that is too.
I would say that when I said that Proposition 2 and 4 are subject to a 2/3 vote requirement, this measure actually has a provision in it that says that if measures that are currently on the ballot pass and this measure passes, then if they attain 55%, not 2/3 is required, they would also pass. They would be adopted. So it's a little backdoor thing, but I think you need to be aware of that it's not technically retroactive, but it does apply to some measures. So if this is adopted, those measures could, even if it seemed, let's just say we had a long vote count and it wasn't decided, the fate of those measures 2 and 4 depends, or could depend on what happens with 5.
Yeah, and so, you know, that we'll take some questions about that, and I don't even know if I want to ask Dave because he knows too much. Go ahead, Dave.
Bonds, I guess. I stand corrected. I stand corrected, 50%. Yes, majority votes.
Yeah, majority
I
votes
stand corrected.
on this ballot, majority votes, yes. Yeah, on this ballot. But what they're changing is the bond measure votes in the future.
It would affect. Right.
Local bonds,
It
yes,
would
correct.
affect local bonds.
Local
right,
bonds,
not
yes.
state bonds.
Good clarification, Dave, thank you. Yeah, good clarification, thank you. There was a question here on before we move on, but the other ones?
As you all know, the school infrastructure is always depreciated.
Yes.
Why we keep putting money in the infrastructure instead of putting the money in educating our children better? So in that case, we should have the education run by private sector. Then we totally get rid of that infrastructure.
Yeah, but well, we're not here to debate how we do education. We're here to debate, you know, we're here to talk about the initiative itself. No, you're welcome to your opinion on it. I'm just saying we're here to talk about these particular initiatives that are there. So that's what's important right now. And any other questions on those 5 that the legislature's putting on the ballot before we move on to the ones the people put on? Yes. No, this is requiring them to work. Well, I don't think it goes into that. I don't think it goes into that definition.
Inmates have all day to find loopholes in things, and they will find loopholes, and they will, I don't have to do that because that's
Well, they. Good. Well, and so we now have an opposition statement. So, okay. Yes, but currently it's defined as work, and how that plays out. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I've seen a lot of jailhouse handwritten petitions in the court. I predict there will be a few there, and quite often they get denied.
So these are the 5 that are put on by the legislature that we talked about here. 2 of them dealing with sort of value propositions, and 3 of them dealing with financial issues, bonding, et cetera, you know, around that type of thing. And as Chuck said, you know, it's very helpful to read the background in this, see who's supporting, see who's opposing, you know, and understand the context. The legislature put these on the ballot because and the people that we voted for to be there put it on the ballot for a variety of reasons.
Well, I would say for the prison system, as is, it works really well because I've been there for 10 years. Well, to teach Bible study. Every Thursday night I go there. The inmates themselves, they have a job. They're willing to work because they get paid. And also they have chores
Sure.
to clean up. So I would just say keep the current condition.
Well, but that's not what this is proposing. This is proposing that we cannot force people in prison to work, and that's what it. And so they can voluntarily work still. It's not eliminating work within the prison system. It's just saying we can't tell a prisoner that, you know, you're sentenced here for 10 years and you have to work and do this job. We cannot tell them that, and that's what's being eliminated right now.
Let's move on to the next set.
Yeah, catch me afterwards, Rick. We'll do that.
We'll catch up with some questions. So we're going to talk about the warring rent control measures now.
Well, but I mean, we can get into the nitty-gritty about that, but this is about what we require prisoners to work currently, and this says we cannot require them to work. They can still do the works they're doing, they can still get the credits that they can get for it and all that type of thing. Yeah, Yeah, they use the word slavery because it's involuntary servitude is what's written into the statute currently.
So on to Propositions 33 and
Those
34.
were fun. Now we'll do the
Appreciate
now
the
we'll do other ones.
comments, but again, we're not here to offer a debate on either direct or indirect issues, but try to help educate you on these measures. Proposition 33 is a measure that would, as a matter of state law, prohibit, well, it would repeal an existing state law that limits local rent control measures for residential rental properties. And interestingly, now the question as to what rental property may include, because there's so many other types of rentals that occur, from vacation rentals to home rentals. But the present state law essentially bars local rent control measures to be imposed on anything but newly constructed projects. Older projects that date back to the inception of that law, which I think was in 1985, cannot be subject to rent control. So this would eliminate that prohibition and allow local jurisdictions to impose rent controls. A number of local jurisdictions do impose rent control laws, primarily charter cities that have not been subject to the state law that applies to general law cities. The proponents of it have supported a number of attempts at local rent control around the Bay Area and in Los Angeles and larger cities in particular. But this would open it up to any rent control law that any city or local jurisdiction might wish to impose. And I think that's...
Yeah, that's a good summary. It's a fairly controversial one of the more controversial ones on the ballot in terms of rent control and how we approach rent control, and to what extent do we give local government the opportunity to do that or not do that, and that's what's at stake here. It's a fascinating list of people who are proponents and a fascinating list of people who are opponents. And so you might be interested in reviewing that and looking at it. It gets into the weeds about rent control. It really does.
This one has had the most money spent on it of any measure that's on the ballot. $38 million has been spent thus far by proponents and $100 million by opponents. 33.
That's 33.
That's 33. 34 is a very interesting measure, which would essentially restrict spending of prescription drug revenues that have been obtained by certain healthcare providers. And it's a broad, it doesn't really relate directly to rent control, but the main proponent of Proposition 33 is the major funder of that rent control measure. And that particular funder would be directly affected by this measure because it is a private foundation that receives money for really selling at discounted rates prescription drugs, and it's taken basically the profit that it takes from the sale of those drugs and put that money into state rent control measures in the past. So this would simply impose a requirement on any organization, whatever it may be, that has revenues of $100 million or more from spending less than 98% of its net revenues on things other than the specific things that it's authorized to do by its nonprofit status. So it's a backhanded thing, but clear object of it is a group called the AIDS Healthcare Foundation that's based in Los Angeles, which has been the primary funder of these statewide rent control measures that have failed, but they've been on every ballot for 2 or 3 successive statewide elections.
And that's why you see the opponents argue that this is the revenge initiative. So, you know, it's this is why we put 33 and 34 together here. I mean, they're definitely related in terms of who's opposing and who's supporting and why they're on the ballot. The rent control and who's responsible for the details of rent control, and this other measure, who's responsible for prescription drug benefits funding from the federal government, and if you don't spend enough of that, you know, then you get in big trouble. And so but the group that's funding this one over here is the one that's the target of this one over here. So it's a little what would you say?
It's a bank shot.
So anyway, but you know, 34 is of interest to people because of rent control and what that means and how it's done, and there's a lot of detail to that.
So now we're going to take up Prop 32, which is a measure that would raise the state minimum wage to $18 per hour. And the way that it's structured is that it would apply first to employers of more than 25 employees, and that increase, if adopted, would go into effect in stages. So on January 1st of 2025, it would go from to $17 per hour, and then the following January it would go to $18 an hour. For employers of 25 or less, it would be delayed in its implementation by 1 year. So it would go into effect for those employees of those employers 1 year later. There are a variety of other minimum wage laws that are currently in effect. Currently we have a staged and phased in $25 per hour minimum wage for fast food workers, and also for healthcare workers. And then in Los Angeles, I think, is one city where they have a specific minimum wage raise that is in effect for hotel workers in the LAX hotel corridor. So if this were adopted, it would apply differently to employees in those categories, the fast food workers, healthcare workers, LAX workers, and in fact, for them it would be below the rate that the current law allows them to, so it wouldn't even apply to them. But it would apply more generally to any employee, and that would raise the minimum wage for them. It's unclear to me, in this document, this legislative analyst says that the average minimum wage now is $16.50 an hour, so it looks like it's not quite as much of a bump above the average as I had believed. I believed that the average minimum wage was somewhat lower than that. In any event, it's worth looking at, but again, it would apply across the board to all minimum wage employees. The opponents of it say that it's going to cost jobs, reduce margins for small businesses and that kind of thing, and have an adverse effect on the economy. The proponents of it say that it's in the current cost of living in California, that it's an important thing to adopt.
It's an interesting proposition because it proposes, you know, bottom line, it proposes in January of 2026, the minimum wage in California will be $18 an hour. That's what the initiative proposes. The opponents of this are the Chamber of Commerce and groups that you would expect as you read that. What I found fascinating when I looked at it, the proponents, no one is listed as supporters, because this was put on the ballot by one individual who put up the money to put this on the ballot. And so it's, you know, and as Chuck has mentioned, you know, the minimum wage is floating right now around California between anywhere from $16.50 to $25, depending on what you're in. The analysis of this says this will impact about 2 million workers currently in California. And so that's where we are. Let's pause and take a question. Rick? I didn't, the question is who determines it subsequently after 2026? Okay. Yeah. The mic's off. The question he's asking is who and how is it determined after 2026, how the minimum wage is set based on the living, based on, yeah, Chuck's going to answer that.
It has a cost of living adjustment in it. So after that first round of increases, subsequently it would be raised by whatever the cost of living was between you know, year 2 and any out year. The Department of Industrial Relations, State Department of Industrial Relations, I think publishes an annual cost of living adjustment for and that also happens in these other categories of fast food, healthcare worker.
Yes.
Well, you're doing, what it does is a one-time specific adjustment, and then it puts it on a cost of living escalator.
From then on, yeah, it goes to a cost of living from that point on. You know, what I found fascinating is that there wasn't a lot of support from, you know, unions, from different, you know, organizations of workers, and, you know, and the usual people that would support a minimum wage increase. It wasn't supported. And so it's like, okay, well, if they don't support this, why don't they support this? And so what's, you know, what's particularly wrong with this, I don't know. The question is, the cost of living index would be the same one they're using for Social Security, et cetera?
It's not quite the same. I think they use a different measure.
Statewide.
Undoubtedly, what the Social Security does is based on similar principles, but not identical. So
Yes.
we're on to 35 and 36. So Proposition 35 is one that basically earmarks funds from the funding of the Medi-Cal. There's let's see, I'm trying to think of blanking on the name of the tax itself. It's an MPO tax.
Yeah, something like that.
Anyway, it's a tax that's imposed on healthcare providers that is used specifically to fund the state portion of state Medi-Cal. And the history of this is that like some other funds that state government acquires, are subject to appropriation by the governor and the legislature through the annual budget process. And frequently, that's been viewed as one of the slush funds available for the governor and the legislature to deal with budget deficit problems and that sort of thing. So the managed care providers put this on the ballot, and interestingly, you'll find no specific opposition to this measure in the ballot pamphlet. However, there are opponents of it. The governor and the legislature have an institutional interest in preserving the flexibility, their flexibility to deal with things like budget deficits, and this is a fund that they've become accustomed to using for that. The tax is subject to renewal. And so what this measure does is it actually renews and makes permanent that tax. And that tax is paid basically by either healthcare users or insurance companies for private insured. And as is often the case, the private insurance market with private insureds bears some of the cost of public insurance that is provided for health care. Anyway, the ostensible purpose of this is to fix that all of those funds raised by that tax would be available for state Medi-Cal services. So that has its own set of beneficiaries and opponents. Among the beneficiaries are the abortion reproductive services providers, but all other physicians and hospital groups and so on that are paid out of Medi-Cal funds, which, if the legislature took the money for other purposes, wouldn't have been available for use for that purpose.
Yeah, it's funded. Chuck's laid it out very nicely. The supporters of this are the California Medical Association, the variety of associations of doctors, nurses, obstetricians, people who get paid. Medi-Cal by the state of California want to get paid, and they're struggling with the fact that the governor in the budget deficit was interested in using this slush fund not to increase their payments, but to fund other things that the state viewed as appropriate. And so that's why there's no opposition listed, because no one other than the governor and the legislature is particularly opposed to it or going to list themselves opposed to it. But the proponents are very in favor of moving this forward. For myself, I struggle with, and this is just for me, and I don't know if it's for you, but for me, I struggle with the fact that the governor has been very adamant about his reproductive rights agenda and what he wants to do, and he wants to fund it with this. And he wants to fund it with this. So that presents a problem for me. It may not present a problem for you. It doesn't present a problem for the medical community, because they want to get reimbursed for a lot of the things that they're doing out there right now.
There's one other category of beneficiary of this, and that is undocumented individuals who, under state law, or a certain percent, a number of them are provided benefits, and it's been a movable thing from young people to seniors to potentially everyone. And so some people have opposed this one as they might on the abortion ground, some not necessarily the same set of people, because state is funding these things for these different categories of service. So that's, it might be an odd situation to find the governor, if he were public about it, on the same side as people who oppose the state funding of either reproductive rights abortion services or Medi-Cal services to illegal undocumented immigrants.
Prop 36?
Prop 36 is the last one, and this one was put on by the citizens, and it's the one that concerns strengthening the provisions of state law regarding retail theft, which I think is commonly understood as epidemic in the state, and we've all seen, heard about, or read examples of things like smash and grabs, and that have led to the closure of a wide variety of both pharmacies and retail establishments in the larger cities in particular, and maybe even here in Sacramento. I'm not that familiar, not having lived here actually for a few years. But The other thing that Prop 36, and so what it does is reestablishes that multiple offenses can accumulate to the $950 threshold, above which someone could be prosecuted by a felony for that kind of theft or ongoing theft. And because the connection in this one is that it also increases sentences for certain drug and theft crimes. And I've talked about the theft crimes, but fentanyl possession and sale in particular is another crisis problem. And this would increase the penalties, but also establish a standard of treatment and care for those things for people who are trying to use the government services, a variety of government services, to get off their addiction. And that's really focused on the user as opposed to the seller. The legislature and the governor had a number of things that they were trying to do. And in fact, legislation, I think up to 12 or 14 bills were actually adopted in this session that were trying to head off this ballot proposition because it had also redefined the prior initiatives had redefined as non-serious felonies, or in the case of the retail theft, $950 threshold between misdemeanor and felony. And the way it was being interpreted by the police and the district attorneys in the major cities was not to prosecute anybody. The governor and the legislature felt that this was a little too far in the direction of cutting back on some of the criminal justice reforms that had been adopted in the last decade. The opponents say, well, yes, we should, and we think that those have been a real problem for this drug and theft explosion that we've had, epidemic, if you will, in the last 10 years or so. The proponents of it are primarily the District Attorneys Association and the retailers, big and small retailers that believe this is a problem best served by this particular bill. The ones that have been adopted by the legislature may or may not be superseded in full by this. There may be some elements of some of those that passed in this past session that would not overlap or not be significantly affected by it. But anyway, that's Prop 36. Do you have any other comments? This doesn't affect three strikes. It doesn't affect the free strikes law.
It does not. Yeah, Chuck has explained it well. You know, the retail groups are very interested in the 950 threshold, which they say because that threshold was set by an earlier proposition has invited criminals to step forward. This one says that, you know, if you are guilty of drug possession and or another offense 2 times, the 950 drops. And so you can then be prosecuted for a felony, even if you went and stole something that was $122. You could be prosecuted for a felony along that way. The challenge here is the battle back and forth between, you know, how do we best deal with thefts? How do we best deal with drug abuse, with people selling drugs? And, you know, this is a particular vision of how we want to do it. When we passed a different proposition, was it 47, I think, some years ago, you know, we had a different vision of it at that time. You know, we wanted to set a limit so that we weren't throwing everybody in jail, you know, along the way. And, you know, it goes back and forth around that particular issue about how are we going to deal with crime. And this is an attempt to adjust Prop 47, basically, to deal with that 950 threshold and to deal with the current reality of drug sales, particularly, as Chuck mentioned, fentanyl, you know, drug sales and drug possession in California. The District Attorneys Association is big on this. They want it. They want some firm standards around which they can begin to prosecute people. And the rest of the battle is among the rest of us trying to figure out what's the best way to deal with crime and drugs. So.
Yeah, I don't think this will, if this passes, will end the sort of the movement really toward criminal justice reform, lessening bail requirements or eliminating bail requirements and that sort of thing. I think is still going to be in play. This is a longer term issue that has proponents on both sides.
Yes, and probably one of the more controversial issues is on the ballot right now. And it's on the ballot because the negotiations with the proponents of this initiative in the legislature fell through, even though the legislature passed many, many pieces of legislation to try and address it, but did not satisfy primarily the District Attorneys Association and the retailers. It did not satisfy their issues along the way. Those are 5 propositions that were put on the ballot by a vote of the people, by the signatures of the people, and they're going to be before us. Any other last questions or things, or do you want us all to tell you how to vote right now? So, that's all right. Yeah. Yes. Prop 33, rent control. You want to know which rental properties are subject to this? Right.
Well, this measure basically eliminates the existing state law. I think that what it would do if it passed is to leave to the local jurisdictions to define exceptions. You know, for example, you know, is it a homeowner subject to this if they rent their an apartment that they own that's attached? I mean, there are a whole variety of exceptions in current laws for that. So. There's likely to be quite a variety of different local laws that are adopted, and undoubtedly some will consider some exceptions so that it doesn't apply more onerously, but to small individual property owners or small apartment owners.
And I would suggest if you do own property for rental, and what Chuck's saying, this empowers local government to do it, not the state. So, but you would want to read the details of Proposition 33. You know, you'd want to read what they're eliminating, basically the state law at the present moment, and what that would mean in terms of what would be exposed at this point to local jurisdictions setting a rent control law is something you would be very interested in right now. Yes. Is the current rent control law state or local?
Well, I honestly don't know that.
I can't answer
Sacramento is a charter. That's, yeah. This.
That's a state law.
This probably will put the state law, as far as that goes, in some doubt, and I think that, you know, it introduces the possibility of all kinds of different interpretations of that, and different exceptions and exclusions and all of that will occur if it passes.
Well, the proponents of this are interested in working with local government to use their local control to keep the lid on rents because they're saying it's too high, And they're really very clear about that when you read the literature on it, that it's just too high, and we need to not have an arbitrary statewide thing that goes on. We need to be pushing local governments to basically do the rent control. The opponents are saying if you do that, there's going to be less available for rent. That's their argument. They're going to say, okay, if you control that, I'm going to get out of the rental market. I'm not going to do that, you know. And so it's a debate between, you know, do we need rent control, and where's the most effective way to do that rent control, and or, you know, if we do rent control too vigorously or too much, will we lose the housing that we need? And it's not an easy discussion to have, and people are on different sides of that issue. And obviously, if you're renting property and that kind of thing, you have an opinion on it. And if you're living next to people who are complaining about their rent all the time, you got another opinion on it. So it's a challenge.
What makes that even more emphatic is the cost of building has gone up with inflation, and so it costs the developer more money to produce the same product that maybe he could have produced for less money a year ago. But if he's faced with rent control, then he doesn't have a profit, or his profitability is so slim that a lender won't lend because he doesn't have enough of a cushion. So therefore, the housing doesn't get built.
Yeah, that is the argument that is made by the opposition to this very strenuously. You probably could have written it for them right there. Yeah, you know, when you read it, that's their argument very strenuously, is, you know, is we will lose housing and we will lose developers building housing because they won't do it because there's no profit in it.
Well, thank you all for coming. I hope this was
We'll stick around and answer
helpful,
a few
and
questions,
yes, we
not too
will.
long, but we'll answer a few questions. Thank you all, and vote your conscience out there.